Welcome to the Justice Stories Podcast, a series dedicated to presenting the stories of those who serve in the Department of Justice and those who work and live to serve the cause of justice in America. These are the stories behind the stories, told by the people who live them.
See the president coming out now. We just have to watch. I don't know whether we can hear this or not. There. Shots. God. These are the agents immediately driving after the assailant. There are 2 or 3 people down on the...
This is an excerpt from ABC News on March 30th, 1981, as they broadcast the scene outside the Washington Hilton. Ronald Reagan, 40th President of the United States, was hit by a bullet along with 3 others. Tom Baker was the first FBI agent on the scene and happened to be the person to take charge of the investigation and crime scene that fateful day. In our previous episode, Baker described the chaos he encountered when he arrived just minutes after the shooting. In this episode, he reflects on how he and his colleagues took in the seriousness of the event and began to bring order to that chaos. Within minutes, more FBI agents arrived to begin the process of protecting and developing the crime scenes. The Hilton, where the shooting took place, the hospital where the president was rushed into surgery, and the president's limousine, and then the alleged shooter's hotel room. The investigation ultimately revealed the sad truth of the unhinged nature of the crime, a desperate, ultimately insane attempt by John Hinckley Jr. to become famous as the means of impressing the actress Jodie Foster. Hinckley's deranged actions brought the presidency into crisis.
I was still out on the street. A fellow came up to me, Lopresti was his name. He was the deputy to Brady, the presidential press secretary, who had been shot and hurt severely. And Lopresti said he was from the White House and that he would stay with me. And a lot of press started gathering around me at the time, also on the street. I had in my mind what I would say to the press. I thought about that in the car too, and I wanted to make just a very short statement, because I saw this as a crisis. That's a key point here. Today, we all know that this was done by a mentally deranged young man, Hinckley. But back in those, especially in the first hour, in the first minutes, we didn't know that. We knew it was a crisis. I didn't know who was behind this or if other officials were going to be shot. So I just wanted to calm the public and clear the parameters. And my only press statement, which I repeated, and several people came up to me immediately there, was that I'm from the FBI. The FBI identified myself. The FBI is taking charge of the investigation, and we're on the scene right now. And that's the only message I wanted to get out, and that's how I'm quoted in papers across the country the following day. We stayed out on the street, or I stayed out on the street for probably a full 5 to 10 minutes, and perhaps longer, before we went into the command post. And out there I was, handling the press, handling the White House people, dealing with the top people from Secret Service and the Park Police, as well as the Metropolitan Police. And one by one, 2 by 2, our agents showed up. And that's where I started to divide up the responsibilities amongst our agents. And that's where we get into the crime scene search and other matters. So what happened, one of the first supervisors on the scene, I told him to keep the witnesses, and he decided to. We heard the witnesses that we could find right there, including the people who had been in the audience, back into the auditorium, so to get them off the street. And that's where they conducted all the interviews, just off the street, which was good. Another individual was in charge of the actual crime scene, and with the police, They backed up and pretty quickly got the yellow evidence tape up over a wide area and started literally picking up every bit of debris off the street that they could, including cigarette butts and everything else. And all of that was collected and has been preserved till this day. Well, one of the first things I did, and the first time I ever chose anyone by name, when Captain Wilson from the Metropolitan Police came up to me with the revolver, he also told me they had just taken Hinckley to the homicide section at MPD headquarters. But I happened to know there were a couple of agents, two real veteran agents, Henry Regal and George Schimmel, who were two real experienced agents, worked bank robberies by reputation. They were good interviewers. They were with at least one younger, pretty new agent going over to actually have a meeting on bank robbery matters that day. That's another thing I was sort of on top of, and I knew they were over there. So I called to our base and told them have Regal and Schimmel go attempt to interview the shooter, I knew that's where he was being taken. Then another agent, supervisor, we had go to the hospital where the president had just been taken. That became a major crime scene, the search there for the search of the president and his belongings, because that's quite significant. And then the other scene, the Secret Service eventually got their limo from the hospital to their garage, which was also in D.C., and that was processed because the president was actually hit with a shot Hinckley took that hit the side of the car, ricocheted, and went through an opening between the door and the body of the car as the president was entering or being pushed into the car. And his arm was extended in a wave. So the bullet went under like in his armpit almost, and lodged right beside his heart. So we have the Hilton is the main focus of the investigation. Then we have a crime scene at the car. We have a crime scene at the hospital. So very quickly we have 2 or 3 other focuses of investigation, even in that first hour. When the president got there, President Ronald Reagan tried to step out of the car himself and walk under his own power into the emergency room, and he collapsed immediately. He fell to the floor because he had lost a lot of blood. The hospital staff picked him up and took him into the emergency room, and one of the first things they do in their protocol, because they started immediately treating him. This was real trauma. He's been shot and he's bleeding profusely. Their protocol, the hospital employees, they cut his clothes off him, cut them right off. So his pants, his shirt, his suit jacket, all his belongings fell to the floor, and then they took him on in to be treated in this emergency operation. When our agents got there, they started processing that crime scene, recovering all his clothing as evidence. His shirt was totally blood-soaked. His suit jacket was blood-stained as well. And like most presidents, he didn't carry very much on his person. He didn't carry a wallet or money on him. But he did have in his pocket an item, a significant item, which later learned was called the authentication card. So in his blood, right on the floor, our agent picks up this card. It was like an ATM card, a little bit bigger, a little bit thicker, and as cards did back then, it actually had a few rectangular holes punched into it. Well, we learned later, much later actually, that evening and the next day, there's always this is very necessary for the nuclear codes, this particular card. It's very important. And in some of the photographs of even when the day President Reagan was shot, but other pictures of other presidents, you sometimes see a uniformed military officer following right behind carrying this big leather satchel. And that's called the football. And the football is what everybody thinks of, or everybody thought of then, was needed to utilize the nuclear weapons in the event of a nuclear attack. In fact, well, that's true, but in fact, The president has the authentication card. He's the only authority that has that card, and he inserts that card into the football, and that tells command and control of the nuclear weapons up and down the line that this is really the president, and this is really the actual orders. So that very important piece of equipment that nobody really knew what it was initially, our agents picked off the floor of the emergency room out of the president's blood. So I moved forward. We set up this model, actually, forward command post, right, feet away from the scene at the Washington Hilton, and we ran the investigation all that day and into the evening from that position. They ran it a lot of extra landlines, and we took it all there. The agents who went immediately to the Washington Metropolitan Police Department, they got Hinckley there, and they took him back to the Washington field office, and that's where he was processed, fingerprinted, and photographed. And they advised him of his rights, gave him a warning and waiver form, and he didn't try to hide his identity, and he didn't deny what he did. And so they proceeded with him there, and he told them where he had been staying. Then we assigned an agent. It was actually one of these younger agents who had been with them at the police department, Tom Bush, to prepare an affidavit for a search warrant. And they worked most of the day with Chuck Ruff and AUSAs in his office to do that. And once again, that was also done with a great deal of care. And the swearing to the affidavit was done before a district judge and everything like that, because it turns out that the people in the U.S. Attorney's Office were thinking exactly like we were. They wanted to do everything exactly correctly. So they're preparing the affidavit and then the search warrant. In the meantime, we sent police and FBI agents to the hotel. They did not go in the room. They did not search the room. What they did, they secured the room. So all afternoon, we had, into the evening until the search happened, we had an agent and a police officer outside the room to prevent anybody else from disturbing the crime scene. So he's in the Washington field office most of the day. That's where the agents have him. They're interviewing him and everything else. After several hours, it became apparent that this, well, to us, obviously disturbed young man did this, not to demean him, but he seems like a very fragile, I would characterize as a soft individual. There was a lot of problems in those days, perhaps there still are, in the D.C. jail, where he would normally be lodged with someone in this, committing a crime in D.C. like this. And we all knew this guy's not going to last 5 minutes in there. We didn't want him mistreated, much less killed. So what we did, it was a little extraordinary. The FBI had a very good rapport with the Marines running the Marine Corps base at Quantico, where FBI had facilities for years. So they drove him in a caravan of cars to Quantico. I took him outside the district where it happened and lodged him that evening in the Marine brig, the little jail, prison, military lockup that the Marines had on the base. And the Marines guarded him, kept him alone all night, and guarded him there for safekeeping. This was another big fear, that we put him in the usual situation. He would be, at a minimum, there's a risk that he could be killed or hurt, and we didn't want that to happen. When Tom Bush and the search team were ready to go to the hotel room and execute the search warrant, it was quite late that night. I mean, it was it was after 9 p.m. I have somewhere I've noted the actual time. And I left, that's when I finally left the Washington Hilton, went over and joined the search team, and then we entered the room. The first thing we did, because we had given it a lot of thought, the first thing they did was film the room and then photograph the room before anything was disturbed. And then a couple of agents and I think fingerprint technician as well went in and processed the surfaces in the room for fingerprints. This normally would not be necessary in a routine search, but we did this just in case down the road. We're thinking of co-conspirators now. We're very aware who else might be involved. Although the subject has told us no one else is involved, we want to make sure. So we processed and preserved all the fingerprints in that room. In case another name came up, we could see if they had been there. Once that was done, we searched the room. And Hinckley had on a desk in his room. This is at the Park Central Hotel in D.C., a hotel that doesn't exist anymore. On the little desk in the hotel room, he had neatly laid out the newspaper from that morning, which had printed the presidential schedule for the day in it, and he had circled the event at the Hilton. There was a map, a D.C. like tourist map, circled the Hilton as well. And then there's a statement in his handwriting in the form of a letter to the actress Jodie Foster, with whom he was infatuated. And the letter just stated right out that he was doing, and I think he even called world's historical deed to win her love. So there it was, the whole motive and everything else just right there laid out for us to find. The following day, I went with the case agent to his initial hearing, his initial appearance in court in D.C., and he looked the same way there as he looked just before the shooting. Had the photograph of him before the shooting. Very impassive, no emotion on his face whatsoever. I mean, just flat effect, no sign of any emotion. That's just how he was. Just how he appeared then. When a young man said that he's going to kill the president of the United States to win the heart of an attractive movie star, in my mind, quote unquote, in layman's terms, this guy's crazy. But the U.S. attorney and his staff, and the lead assistant U.S. attorney ultimately at the trial was Roger Edelman, who's had a very distinguished career. But there were others who worked on it as well. They believed they could get a conviction. They believed that the nature of his narcissistic, delusional behavior was such that he still knew right from wrong, which was the standard, of course. And they thought they could get a conviction. So they proceeded. And then when the jury did find him not guilty by reason of insanity, or found him insane, there was a lot of disappointment. And, of course, in the country, there was a lot of outrage because it was evident. It ultimately led to a change in the federal law, the Insanity Defense Reform Act, and most states in turn changed their law, and it shifted the burden completely from the government to the defense to show insanity, made it much harder. There were several states abolished the insanity defense completely. So there was a big shift there, and this type of defense is not used as regularly in federal cases now because of that.
Tom Baker retired from the FBI in 2000 after a long and distinguished career of 33 years. He has and continues to appear and speak of his role in that landmark case. The Justice Stories podcast is produced for the U.S. Department of Justice by the Office of Legal Education in the Executive Office for United States Attorneys. Mark Yancey, Chief Learning Officer for OLE, is Executive Producer. Angela Dooley, Assistant Chief Learning Officer, is Supervisory Producer. If you have any comments and suggestions for the Justice Stories podcast, contact producer Tim Carrier at tim.carrier@usdoj.gov. We want to hear your justice stories.